I was called a thief while moving my TV into my own house, the very house I just bought with all my savings. There I was, unloading my stuff, when my new neighbor, who somehow decided she was the HOA president, marched up with a clipboard and accused me of stealing from my own home. Yep, you heard that right. I was apparently stealing my own things, even though I had the keys and paperwork to prove it. How does that even happen? Have you ever dealt with a neighbor who thought they ran the whole neighborhood? Or had an HOA Karen moment? Drop a comment and share your stories. It was a Saturday morning, 9 a.m. sharp, and I'd just finished the closing process on my first house in Pine Ridge, a quiet suburb outside Colorado Springs. After 4 years of saving every penny from my freelance photography business, skipping vacations, eating ramen more nights than I care to admit, watching every dollar like it might disappear, I finally had the keys to 412 Pine Street. This wasn't just a house purchase, it was 4 years of sacrifice finally paying off, the culmination of dreams that had kept me working late into countless nights. The modest 2-bedroom ranch with its decent-sized yard represented everything I'd worked toward, a space I could already picture filled with camera equipment for outdoor shoots and maybe, someday, a family of my own. The U-Haul was packed tight with everything I owned, and I was methodically unloading boxes, trying to be respectful of my new neighbors by keeping the noise down and working efficiently. That's when she appeared, like some kind of suburban apparition from House 387 Pine. Her red bodysuit was fitted perfectly, paired with a white A-line skirt that swayed as she marched toward me, in matching red heels that clicked authoritatively on the asphalt. Everything about her screamed, "Look at me," while I stood there in my practical moving clothes, just trying to get my TV safely inside my new home. "Excuse me, stop right there," she announced like she was calling a board meeting to order. "I'm Lana Mathers, HOA president, and you are not authorized to remove items from this property." Her voice had that particular pitch that cuts through morning air and makes dogs start barking. She positioned herself between me and my front door, clipboard held up like a shield, planted firmly on my driveway like she owned the place. I stood there, frozen, holding a 43-inch television, and I honestly couldn't process what emotions were hitting me first. Was it anger at being falsely accused, humiliation at having neighbors witness this spectacle, or genuine fear that some kind of misunderstanding could result in me being handcuffed in broad daylight on my own property? 4 years of saving, months of house hunting, weeks of paperwork, and now this woman was treating me like a criminal for moving into my own home. I set the TV down carefully on the porch and pulled out my phone, showing her the digital copies of my closing documents, the keys that were still warm in my pocket, and my driver's license with the same address. "Ma'am, I just bought this house. I have all the paperwork right here, and these are my keys." But Lana waved her hand dismissively, her white skirt swishing as she turned away from my evidence. Anybody can fake documents these days. I know for a fact that Mr. Peterson didn't sell this house. The funny thing was, she was half right about Mr. Peterson. He had lived here for 30 years before moving to Florida, but apparently nobody had bothered to tell the self-appointed neighborhood watch. By now, neighbors were starting to peek out from behind curtains and crack open front doors. Dave Thompson from across the street was pretending to check his mailbox while obviously watching the show. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman next door, had her face pressed against her kitchen window like she was watching a soap opera. The contrast between my practical moving outfit and Lana's formal wear was creating exactly the kind of spectacle that makes suburban gossip mills run for months. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of absurd theater production where I hadn't been given the script, and everyone was staring at the guy who didn't know his lines. That's when Lana pulled out her phone in a red case that matched her outfit, because of course it did, and announced with theatrical flair, "I'm calling the police to report a burglary in progress." I stood there with my hands still on the TV, wearing my reasonable navy joggers and gray shirt, looking like exactly what I was, a guy moving into his own house. Meanwhile, she started dialing 911 while dressed like she was about to give a presentation to the Junior League. The absurdity of the situation was starting to sink in, and I had a terrible feeling this was just the beginning. As she spoke dramatically to the dispatcher, describing a suspicious individual removing property without authorization, I realized something important about the woman standing in my driveway. Color coordinated from head to toe at 9 in the morning. She wasn't just nosy or confused, she was performing. 20 minutes later, I watched her click-clack back toward her mother's house in those red heels, her perfect outfit somehow making her retreat even more dramatic. I thought that was the end of it, But as I moved the last box into my new home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lana had just been warming up. I had no idea I was about to become the star of the longest neighborhood drama of my life. 20 minutes later, Officer Martinez pulled up in his patrol car, looking professionally skeptical as he took in the scene. There I was, in my reasonable athletic wear, holding legitimate paperwork, standing next to a woman who'd apparently gotten dressed for a corporate event to police the neighborhood. The visual alone told most of the story. Serious police officer, normal guy in moving clothes, and someone who looked like she'd wandered off a movie set. Lana immediately launched into her performance, gesturing dramatically with her clipboard while her white skirt swayed with every emphatic movement. But Officer Martinez maintained his professional demeanor while clearly trying not to smile. He examined my closing documents, checked my ID against the address, watched me unlock the front door with keys that obviously worked, and politely listened to Lana's increasingly theatrical accusations. By the time Martinez was ready to leave, even she seemed to realize how foolish she looked. As the patrol car pulled away, she muttered something about needing better background checks on buyers and retreated toward her mother's house, leaving me standing in my driveway, wondering if I'd just experienced the strangest welcome to suburbia in human history. Dave Thompson sent me a text that evening that made me laugh out loud. "Dude, did they hold casting calls for evil neighbor roles while I wasn't looking?" I thought that was the end of it. I was spectacularly wrong. 24 hours later, I found something in my mailbox that made me realize Lana's morning costume hadn't been random. It had been a uniform. The letter was printed on what appeared to be official letterhead, reading Pine Ridge HOA, with a red header on white paper, trying desperately to look authoritative. The violations were absurd. Unauthorized overnight parking of commercial vehicle for my U-Haul, and failure to coordinate moving activities with community standards for having the audacity to move in without her permission. The fine was $750, payable within 72 hours, with a signature in red marker that looked like it belonged on a teenager's diary. That same afternoon, Lana began her social media assault with the precision of someone who'd been planning this campaign for weeks. She'd created posts in a neighborhood safety group, complete with red and white graphics that were obviously meant to look official, but succeeded only in looking like promotional materials for a failed political campaign. Her post featured a photo of me carrying boxes with a caption that made my blood boil. Anyone can print documents these days, but no one can replace genuine community spirit and vigilance. She positioned herself outside my house for what appeared to be a live video, wearing a red cardigan over white blouse, white pants, red accessories, a completely different but equally coordinated outfit. Her performance was worthy of community theater. Residents need to be aware of suspicious individuals claiming property ownership without proper community verification. The community reaction was swift and divided in ways that made me realize how effectively Lana had been building her influence. Within hours, I started receiving private messages from neighbors I'd never met. Mrs. Patterson from 2 streets over sent a cautious inquiry, "Hi, how long have you been living in Pine Ridge?" Another message from someone named Karen, the irony wasn't lost on me, asked if I had proper documentation for residents. These weren't hostile messages, but they carried an undertone of suspicion that made me realize Lana's campaign was working. She'd managed to make normal neighbors question whether their new resident was legitimate, all while wearing costumes that should have been the first red flag about her credibility. The harassment was already affecting my daily life in ways that went beyond simple annoyance. Someone had apparently warned delivery services about conflicting delivery instructions, which explained why my Amazon package containing an outdoor security camera had mysteriously vanished from my porch. My missing package was just a preview of what was coming, but it also triggered something important. My first real anger about the situation. This wasn't just neighborhood drama anymore. Lana was actively interfering with my ability to live normally in my own home. Mrs. Henderson knocked softly on my door that evening, looking around nervously like she was conducting a covert operation. She was dressed in a sensible beige cardigan that made Lana's theatrical costumes look even more ridiculous by comparison, and her whispered revelation changed everything. "Honey, there's no HOA here. There never has been. That girl has been pulling this stunt since the Thompson family moved in last year." According to Mrs. Henderson, Lana had harassed the Thompsons with fake violations and community complaints until they'd given up and moved to a different neighborhood. The Martinez family had lasted only 6 months before relocating to escape what they'd called the crazy lady in the red outfits. As she shared these details, I started connecting dots that should have been obvious from the beginning. I Googled Pine Ridge HOA and found absolutely nothing. The City Hall website had no record of any registered homeowners association for our neighborhood. The letterhead, the social media graphics, the coordinated outfits, it was all part of an elaborate performance designed to create an illusion of authority where none existed. The realization hit me like a cold wave. This woman had spent considerable time and effort creating fake documents, establishing fake social media presence, and apparently maintaining an entire wardrobe dedicated to looking official while harassing people in their own neighborhood. Lana wasn't just a nosy neighbor or someone who'd made an honest mistake. She was running a complete fraud, and I was her latest target. As I stared at that fake violation notice with its amateur attempts at legal language, I knew this was far from over. In fact, I was starting to suspect that Lana had just launched the opening salvo in what would become the most elaborate neighborhood war I'd ever witnessed. 3 in the morning, I was jolted awake by the distinctive click-click of heels on concrete and the unmistakable sound of someone rummaging through metal trash cans. I peered through the window with my phone's flashlight, certain I must be hallucinating. There she was, dressed like a Victoria's Secret Christmas angel turned raccoon, elbows deep in my trash at 3 a.m., muttering to herself like a waste management prophet. I half expected her to declare a banana peel as contraband. I threw on my navy sleep shorts and gray tank top and stepped outside, my practical sleepwear a stark contrast to her color-coordinated nighttime ensemble. "What are you doing?" I asked, and she looked up without any apparent embarrassment, her red lipstick still perfectly applied despite the hour. "I'm conducting a waste management compliance inspection. You have excessive recyclables and possible hazardous materials." The woman had accessorized her pajamas and was speaking in official-sounding language while literally elbow-deep in my garbage, and somehow I was the suspicious one in this scenario. But Lana's late-night trash inspection was just the beginning of an escalating campaign that would make my life increasingly surreal. Over the following weeks, my trash cans were mysteriously knocked over every morning, creating a mess I had to clean up before work. Someone had redirected my sprinkler heads to spray directly onto my windows instead of the lawn, creating water spots that required daily cleaning. 3 different delivery packages vanished from my porch, including more camera equipment I needed for work projects. Then, Lana crossed a line that transformed annoying harassment into something that felt genuinely threatening and legally problematic. I woke up Tuesday morning to find that someone had changed the lock on my mailbox and attached a laminated sign reading, "HOA fee collection point, payment required for mail access." The audacity was breathtaking. She'd literally locked me out of my own mail delivery and was demanding payment for access. When I called the Postal Service, the customer service representative was as confused as I was. "Sir, nobody can legally restrict access to a residential mailbox, except in cases of non-payment to USPS," she explained. "We'll need to send a technician out immediately, because this constitutes mail tampering, which is a federal offense." The Postal Service technician arrived 3 hours later, a patient man named Robert who seemed genuinely bewildered by the situation. He had to use bolt cutters to remove Lana's lock, then install a new standard lock, while explaining that mail tampering carried serious federal penalties. "In 30 years of doing this job," he told me while completing the paperwork, "I've never seen someone try to privatize a residential mailbox. Your neighbor could be in real trouble if she keeps this up." The entire incident took half my workday to resolve and cost me a freelance photography session I'd had to cancel, which I suspected was exactly the point. Lana wasn't just harassing me, she was actively sabotaging my ability to earn a living. But the mailbox incident triggered something unexpected, a counterattack from Lana that caught me completely off guard and made me realize how far she was willing to escalate this conflict. 2 days later, Officer Martinez showed up at my door with an apologetic expression and a complaint form. Apparently, Lana had filed a report claiming I was conducting surveillance harassment of a female resident because she'd spotted the security camera I'd installed after my packages started disappearing. The irony was almost too perfect. The woman who'd been photographing my house from multiple angles, measuring my grass with rulers, and going through my trash in the middle of the night was now claiming that I was the one conducting inappropriate surveillance. By this point, I was exhausted in ways that went beyond physical tiredness. The constant vigilance, the daily cleanup of harassment aftermath, the time lost dealing with fake complaints and manipulated delivery services, it was wearing me down in ways I hadn't expected. I found myself hesitating before checking my mailbox, wondering what new violation notice or fake legal document might be waiting. I started avoiding my front windows during daylight hours because I never knew when Lana might be out there in full costume, conducting another one of her elaborate inspections. There were moments when I seriously considered just giving up, selling the house and moving somewhere else like the families before me. Maybe it would be easier to let her win than to keep fighting this absurd battle against someone who seemed to have unlimited time and energy for neighborhood terrorism. But something in me refused to back down. Maybe because I remembered those 4 years of saving every penny to buy this house, or maybe because I was starting to realize that this wasn't just about me anymore. Officer Martinez was professional but thorough, examining my camera setup and the footage it had captured. When he saw the recordings of Lana's 3 a.m. trash inspections, her measurement activities in full business attire, and her systematic documentation of my property, his expression shifted from concern to barely contained amusement. "Sir," he said carefully, "I think you might want to consider documenting these interactions more thoroughly. This appears to be part of a pattern of harassment that could escalate further." He was right. Lana wasn't just being annoying anymore. She was actively trying to criminalize my normal responses to her abnormal behavior. That evening, Dave Thompson appeared at my door with a USB drive labeled HOA Evidence Season 1 in his neat handwriting. "Dude," he said, grinning like he'd just solved a murder mystery, "you need to see what I've been recording from my office window." The footage was incredible. Hours of Lana's elaborate performances captured from across the street, including several instances where she'd been talking to herself while conducting her inspections. There was video of her setting up what appeared to be photo shoots of my house, complete with multiple outfit changes and different clipboard accessories. Most damning was footage of her practicing her authority voice while standing in my driveway, apparently rehearsing confrontations that hadn't happened yet. As I watched Dave's security footage, I realized that Lana's harassment wasn't just systematic, it was escalating in ways that suggested she was losing control of her own narrative. The woman who'd started with theatrical complaints about moving violations was now actively interfering with my mail delivery and trying to criminalize my legitimate security measures. She'd gone from neighborhood busybody to someone who was actively sabotaging my daily life, and her increasingly desperate measures suggested she knew her fake authority was being questioned. I had the uncomfortable feeling that Lana's next move would be even more dramatic than anything she'd tried so far. After weeks of living like I was under surveillance by the world's most overdressed private investigator, I decided to treat this situation like the professional problem it had become. I traded my casual home clothes for navy chinos and a white Oxford shirt. If I was going to investigate, I needed to look like someone who takes documentation seriously. My home office, once a peaceful space for editing engagement photos, had transformed into a full-blown war room. Bed strings, screenshots, timeline charts. If the FBI rated HOA harassment, I'd be their lead analyst. The first step was creating a comprehensive timeline of Lana's activities, complete with photos of her various outfit choices correlating with specific harassment incidents. The pattern was remarkable. She'd essentially created a uniform system for different types of neighborhood terrorism. Her outfits weren't just coordinated, they were coded. Red blazer with white skirt meant court is in session. White pants, inspection day. If you gave her a green blouse, she'd probably declare it Arbor Day and fine me for tree misalignment. But more importantly, I was building a case that this wasn't random harassment. It was organized, premeditated, and designed to drive me out of the neighborhood, just like she'd done to previous residents. My investigation revealed details that transformed my understanding of who I was dealing with. Lana Mathers, age 29, had been unemployed for 18 months after leaving what appeared to be a retail management position under circumstances that involved multiple complaints about inappropriate exercise of authority. She lived with her mother at 387 Pine Street in a relationship that social media posts suggested was increasingly strained. Her LinkedIn profile was full of vague references to community leadership and neighborhood improvement initiatives, which I now understood meant systematically harassing people until they moved away. The woman had turned being unemployed into a full-time career in suburban authoritarianism. Mrs. Henderson became my most valuable intelligence source, providing crucial background during our quiet evening conversations that revealed the true scope of Lana's systematic destruction of families. The Thompson family hadn't just been harassed, they'd been financially devastated. According to Mrs. Henderson, Lana had filed false complaints with the city about unpermitted construction that had cost the Thompsons over $2,000 in unnecessary inspections and legal fees. She claimed they built their deck without permits, Mrs. Henderson explained, but the permits were perfectly valid. By the time they proved it, they'd already spent their vacation money on lawyers. The stress had been so severe that Mrs. Thompson had developed anxiety attacks, and they'd eventually sold their house at $15,000 below market value just to escape Lana's campaign. The Martinez family story was even worse. Lana had somehow convinced their mortgage company that they were operating an illegal business from their home because Mr. Martinez occasionally met clients there for his accounting practice. The resulting investigation had nearly cost them their home loan, and they'd been forced to hire both a lawyer and a CPA to prove their activities were completely legitimate. They lost 3 months of sleep and probably 5 years off their lives, Mrs. Henderson said sadly. And all because that woman decided she didn't like having neighbors who worked from home. The systematic nature of Lana's attacks was becoming clear. She didn't just harass people, she researched their vulnerabilities and targeted them where it would hurt most. Dave Thompson's assistance proved invaluable in ways I hadn't expected, partly because he'd been one of Lana's earlier targets before she'd focused on the new families moving in. She sent me one of those fake violation letters about 6 months ago, he explained, showing me a document claiming his home office violated residential zoning restrictions. The letter had looked official enough that Dave had actually called the city to inquire about it, only to discover that home offices were perfectly legal and no such restrictions existed. That's when I started recording everything from my window, he admitted. I figured if she was lying about the law, she was probably lying about other stuff too. His footage showed not just Lana's elaborate preparation rituals, but also her practicing different personas: authoritative HOA president, concerned community member, and victimized neighbor, depending on what role she needed to play for each harassment campaign. But the real breakthrough came when I started researching the legal implications of Lana's fake HOA claims and discovered the scope of potential fraud she'd been committing. A consultation with my college roommate who'd become a lawyer revealed that impersonating a homeowners association constituted fraud in Colorado, while her systematic harassment campaign could potentially escalate to criminal stalking charges. More importantly, he explained that her fake violation notices and fraudulent fine demands were textbook examples of consumer fraud, especially if she'd been collecting money from residents who didn't know enough about property law to challenge her authority. When I mentioned the amounts Mrs. Henderson had told me about, the Thompsons' $2,000 in legal fees, the Martinez family's mortgage complications, my lawyer friend's expression grew serious. If she's been systematically defrauding multiple families, he said, this could be a federal case. My goal shifted from simply defending myself to protecting the entire community from Lana's fraudulent schemes, and ensuring that future residents wouldn't be driven out by someone who turned harassment into a systematic business model. This wasn't just about my peace of mind anymore. It was about stopping a pattern of abuse that had been destroying families for over a year. The more I learned about Lana's previous victims, the more determined I became to make sure she couldn't hurt anyone else. As I compiled evidence and prepared for what I knew would be a public confrontation, I made a strategic decision about how to present my case: professional attire, clear documentation, and the kind of methodical presentation that would make Lana's theatrical performances look like amateur hour. When her inevitable community meeting arrived, I would be ready to expose not just her harassment of me, but her entire fraudulent operation that had been terrorizing Pine Ridge families and costing them thousands of dollars in unnecessary expenses. 3 weeks into what I was privately calling the Lana Show, she announced her master performance: a community meeting at the Pine Ridge Community Center to address ongoing safety concerns and property management issues. The promotional materials were classic Lana: red text on white backgrounds, official-looking headers that had probably taken hours to design, and language that suggested she was convening the United Nations rather than complaining about her neighbor's trash can placement. I made a strategic wardrobe decision for this public confrontation: navy blazer, white dress shirt, khaki pants. The kind of business-appropriate attire that suggests competence without trying too hard. Thursday evening at 7 p.m., I walked into a community center meeting room where 18 neighbors had gathered, most dressed casually for what they expected to be an informal neighborhood discussion. Then Lana made her entrance, and I had to give her credit for commitment to the performance. She'd chosen a show-stopping red cocktail dress with a white blazer, accessorized with a small portable speaker that began playing what sounded like corporate presentation music. Her table display was a masterpiece of theatrical excess. red folders arranged in perfect rows, white laptop positioned just so, and an actual small vase containing red and white flowers that she'd apparently brought from home. The contrast was immediately apparent. A room full of people in suburban casual wear watching someone who'd turned a neighborhood complaint into a multimedia experience. Her PowerPoint presentation was an assault on both logic and visual comfort. Red backgrounds with white text created combinations that were literally painful to read, while slides packed with amateur photography and clip art made my eyes water. But what really caught my attention was her opening statement. "Thank you all for attending this emergency HOA meeting. We're here to address serious concerns about property management and community standards that threaten our shared quality of life." 20 minutes of eye-searing slides followed, displaying blurry photos of my house, dramatic close-ups of my trash cans, and artistic shots of my lawn that she'd apparently taken from multiple angles while wearing various business formal outfits. That's when I politely asked if I could respond to these allegations, and Lana's performance hit its first snag. I'd brought my laptop and a folder of actual evidence, dressed like someone who belonged in a serious discussion rather than a costume party. When I connected to the projector and replaced her carnival show with clean, professional presentations, the difference was like switching from a circus to a documentary. Clear fonts, readable color combinations, and photographs that were actually in focus. The room visibly relaxed when they could finally see slides that didn't require squinting. My evidence reveal was more effective than I'd hoped. The room watched in stunned silence as I projected security footage of Lana's 3 a.m. trash inspections, her elaborate measurement rituals in full business attire, and her systematic documentation of my property while wearing outfits appropriate for board meetings rather than neighborhood patrol. But the most dramatic moment came when I showed Dave Thompson's footage of Lana practicing her authority voice while standing in my driveway, apparently rehearsing confrontations with an imaginary opponent. I could feel the room's energy shift as neighbors realized they'd been watching someone who wasn't just overzealous about community standards, she was actively performing an elaborate fiction. The crowd's reaction was immediate and decisive, but not unanimous. Mrs. Patterson audibly gasped when she saw the rehearsal footage, and even Mr. Williams shook his head in disbelief. But Sandra, from 3 houses down, still seemed unconvinced, and her skepticism created a moment of tension that I realized was crucial to address. "How do we know this isn't all taken out of context?" she asked. Maybe she was just trying to maintain property values. I mean, some of these concerns seem legitimate. And that's when I pulled out the legal documentation that had taken me weeks to compile. The real HOA regulations for our county, the city ordinances that Lana had been misrepresenting, and the actual procedures for establishing legitimate homeowners associations. "Sandra," I said, addressing her directly while displaying the official city documents, "here's what real community authority looks like. This is how you actually establish an HOA. And this is what legitimate violation procedures require. Notice the official seals, the required signatures, the legal language that's actually accurate?" As I walked through the contrast between Lana's amateur theatrics and actual municipal authority, I watched Sandra's expression change. The turning point came when I showed the side-by-side comparison of Lana's fake letterhead with its obvious design flaws and a genuine city document with proper legal formatting. "Oh my God," Sandra said quietly, "I actually believed her when she said my fence was too high. I almost paid for a survey I didn't need." The revelation that Sandra had also been targeted by Lana's fake authority created a ripple effect through the room. Other neighbors started sharing their own encounters, suspicious letters they'd received, warnings about violations that had made them second-guess their own property maintenance, social media posts that had made them feel unwelcome in their own neighborhood. I felt something shift in my chest as I watched the community connect these dots together. A release of tension I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. For weeks I'd felt isolated and under attack, but now I was surrounded by people who understood exactly what I'd been experiencing. The relief was almost overwhelming. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't overreacting, and I wasn't alone. Lana's meltdown was as theatrical as everything else she'd done. She pulled red tissues from her white purse to dab at tears that matched her lipstick, her white blazer flapping as she accused me of photoshopping everything and being dangerous to the community. But her protest sounded increasingly desperate, as neighbors started asking pointed questions about the fake documents, the non-existent HOA, and why she'd been conducting surveillance of multiple properties while dressed like she was attending charity galas. The woman who'd spent weeks making me feel like a criminal was now being questioned by an entire room of people who could see through her performance. Officer Martinez's arrival, responding to my earlier invitation, provided the final reality check. His professional explanation of fraud statutes and harassment laws made it clear that Lana's elaborate performance had crossed well beyond neighborly concern into potential criminal behavior. As he spoke, I watched the last traces of Lana's authority evaporate in real time. The meeting ended with what amounted to an informal community vote of no confidence in her self-appointed leadership, and as she gathered her red folders and white laptop, clicking across the floor in those red heels while her white blazer hung limp with defeat, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Genuine peace. She stepped out of that room leaving behind a trail of red and white debris, but more importantly, she left behind a community that had finally seen through her elaborate masquerade and chosen to stand together instead of being divided by her manipulation. Lana's response to public humiliation was exactly what I'd come to expect. Theatrical escalation. Within 48 hours of the community meeting, she'd filed a police report claiming I had threatened and intimidated her during the presentation, conveniently forgetting that Officer Martinez had witnessed the entire event. Her court appearance outfit was a red power dress with white accessories that belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than a municipal courthouse, creating the same inappropriate formal presentation that had marked all her previous performances. But the legal system proved to be the least of Lana's problems. My investigation had uncovered what turned out to be a much larger pattern of organized fraud that extended far beyond Pine Ridge. That P.O. box at the UPS store wasn't just for our neighborhood. It was headquarters for similar operations across Colorado Springs. Lana had been running fake HOA scams in 2 other communities, Meadowbrook Estates and Sunset Hills. Her methodology was consistent across all 3 locations: establish fake authority through professional-looking documents, target new residents who were unfamiliar with local regulations, and collect fraudulent fines from people who assumed her claims were legitimate. In Meadowbrook Estates alone, she'd collected over $1,200 from 6 different families who'd paid her fake architectural review fees rather than challenge what they thought was legitimate HOA authority. The Sunset Hills operation was even more sophisticated and lucrative. Lana had convinced residents that they needed to pay community improvement assessments, ranging from $50 to $200 per household, supposedly for neighborhood beautification projects that never materialized. Over 8 months, she'd collected nearly $2,000 from families who'd trusted her official-looking letterhead and professional presentation style. The total across all 3 communities was staggering, over $4,500 in fraudulent collections, not counting the additional thousands that families like the Thompsons and Martinez had spent on legal fees and unnecessary inspections caused by her false complaints to city offices. When Channel 7 News picked up the story, the scope of Lana's operation became clear to the entire city. Their coverage featured interviews with families from all 3 targeted neighborhoods, and the visual consistency was striking. Normal people in appropriate casual clothing describing harassment from someone they all identified as the woman in the bright red and white outfits. Her elaborate costume strategy had worked perfectly as a branding mechanism, just not in the way she'd intended. Instead of projecting authority, her theatrical presentations had made her instantly recognizable as a fraud across multiple communities. The media attention triggered a family intervention that was both heartbreaking and revealing. Linda Mathers appeared at my door wearing a sensible beige cardigan, mortified to discover what her daughter had been doing while claiming to handle community business. But the most emotional moment came during Lana's court proceedings, when Mrs. Martinez, one of the families who'd been driven from Pine Ridge, encountered Linda in the courthouse hallway. I watched from across the room as Mrs. Martinez quietly told Linda about the months of anxiety attacks her family had endured, the near loss of their home loan, and the therapy their youngest daughter still needed because she'd developed a fear of authority figures after watching her parents struggle with Lana's harassment campaign. Linda Mathers listened with tears in her eyes as Mrs. Martinez explained how they'd spent their daughter's college fund on legal fees to prove their home-based accounting practice was legitimate, money they were still trying to rebuild 2 years later. "I thought I was raising a daughter who cared about community," Linda whispered to Mrs. Martinez. "I had no idea she was destroying families." The encounter lasted only a few minutes, But I could see it devastated Linda in ways that court documents and news reports hadn't. This wasn't just about fake documents or harassment campaigns. It was about real people whose lives had been damaged by her daughter's elaborate fantasy of authority and control. But the most damaging revelation came from the psychological evaluation that the court ordered as part of Lana's legal proceedings. The assessment revealed classic patterns of narcissistic behavior combined with what the psychologist termed authority compensation syndrome, creating fake positions of power to make up for inability to earn legitimate authority through competence. Her elaborate, color-coordinated presentations were described as performance behaviors designed to create impressions of institutional backing where none existed. In plain English, she'd been playing dress-up with such commitment that she'd convinced herself it was real, and the financial success of her scams had reinforced her delusion that she was providing a legitimate service to communities that needed her oversight. The legal consequences were comprehensive and swift. Lana was required to pay full restitution to all victims of her fake HOA schemes, nearly $5,000 in fraudulent fines plus administrative costs and legal fees. She received 240 hours of community service, which seemed appropriately ironic given her claims about community leadership, plus mandatory counseling and 2 years of probation. Most importantly for my daily life, I obtained a restraining order that prohibited her from contacting me, approaching my property, or continuing any form of harassment campaign. The social consequences were arguably more devastating than the legal ones. Lana's elaborate performance had made her a cautionary tale across Colorado Springs, her signature red and white outfits now serving as a warning sign that someone claiming community authority might not be who they appeared to be. 6 months after Lana's spectacular fall from her imaginary throne, life in Pine Ridge had settled into something I'd never experienced before. Actual community. My photography business was thriving, partly because word had spread about how professionally I'd handled the neighborhood crisis, and clients appreciated working with someone who documented problems as effectively as I'd documented Lana's harassment campaign. The irony wasn't lost on me that her attempts to destroy my reputation had actually enhanced it throughout Colorado Springs. Neighbors who'd been distant during Lana's reign of theatrical terror had become genuinely friendly, united by the shared experience of discovering they'd all been manipulated by someone in costume. The community healing was remarkable to witness. Mrs. Henderson and I had developed a real friendship based on our collaboration during the investigation, and she'd become something of a neighborhood historian, sharing stories about Pine Ridge before Lana's arrival that painted a picture of the peaceful community we were becoming again. Dave Thompson had evolved from helpful neighbor to genuine friend, the kind who actually borrows tools and returns them improved. Even Mrs. Patterson, who'd initially supported Lana's community safety campaign, had apologized and become one of the most vocal advocates for looking out for each other in healthier ways. My symbolic victory came in the form of a woodworking project that perfectly captured the absurdity of the entire experience. Using skills I'd picked up during college, I hand-carved a wooden sign reading "Hoe-Free Zone" in letters deep enough to last for decades. The installation ceremony became an impromptu neighborhood gathering, with over a dozen residents showing up in comfortable casual wear to watch me mount the sign next to my front door. As I drove the final nail into place, I caught Mrs. Henderson's eye and saw something I'd never seen during those first chaotic months. A genuine, relaxed smile that told me we'd all finally found peace. "You know," she said softly, "this is the first time in 2 years I've seen this many neighbors together without someone trying to tell us what we're doing wrong." The neighborhood barbecue I hosted that summer was everything Lana's community meeting had pretended to be, an actual gathering of people who genuinely cared about their shared space. Dave brought his famous potato salad and stories about his kids' soccer season. Mrs. Patterson contributed homemade coleslaw and gossip about the new family moving into the old Martinez house. Sandra, who'd initially defended Lana, showed up with a peach cobbler and a sheepish admission that she'd been so worried about property values that she'd forgotten about human values. The Hendersons brought folding chairs and something even more valuable: stories. "During the war," Mrs. Henderson told us as we sat around my backyard fire pit, "my mother used to say that the worst thing about bad neighbors wasn't the noise or the mess. It was how they made you forget what good neighbors looked like." She gestured around the circle at all of us, relaxed and laughing in the evening light. She said that healing a community after someone toxic leaves isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about remembering who you really are when you're not being attacked. Her words carried weight that went beyond our specific situation. reminding us that what we'd experienced with Lana was an interruption of normal community life, not a definition of it. But even in victory, I maintained a small reminder of vigilance that reflected how the experience had changed me. My Ring doorbell still recorded activity, capturing the ordinary rhythm of suburban life. Delivery drivers, neighbors walking dogs, kids riding bikes. No more red and white figure lurking in the background with measuring tools and clipboards. No more fake legal documents in coordinated envelopes. No more social media campaigns about imaginary safety concerns. Just the peaceful routine of people living their lives without harassment from someone cosplaying as community authority. Yet I kept the cameras running, not from paranoia, but from the hard-earned knowledge that sometimes the most theatrical neighbors are the most dangerous ones. That lesson prompted one final security addition that my friends found amusing, but I considered practical wisdom. I installed one more camera covering the back of my property, not facing any neighbor's windows, but providing a clear view of my rear yard and garden area. When Dave asked about it, I explained with a slight smile. It's not because I'm afraid, it's because I learned that trouble doesn't always come from the direction you're watching. The back camera had already proven its worth, capturing footage of raccoons, raiding my garbage, and a neighbor's escaped dog digging in my garden. Ordinary suburban problems that seemed refreshingly normal after months of coordinated harassment campaigns. Lana herself had become something of a local ghost story, occasionally spotted walking quickly past community gatherings while still wearing her signature red and white combinations, now clearly trying to avoid attention rather than attract it. Her mother had given her an ultimatum about finding legitimate employment and attending therapy sessions, and Linda Mathers had become a regular presence at neighborhood events. The quiet dignity with which Linda handled her daughter's legacy served as a counterpoint to the theatrical chaos Lana had created, reminding us all that family members of difficult people often suffer just as much as their targets. As autumn arrived and I settled into my second year in Pine Ridge, I reflected on what the whole experience had taught me about authority, community, and the difference between earning respect and demanding it. Lana's elaborate red and white performances had failed not because her costumes weren't convincing enough, but because actual community leadership comes from serving others rather than controlling them. Her dramatic rise and fall had been entirely self-created, a one-woman theater production that had entertained no one and helped nobody, but had ultimately brought the rest of us closer together through shared adversity. The lesson was both simple and profound. Cheap authority crumbles when it meets someone who knows how to read the law, but more importantly, genuine community emerges when people choose to support each other instead of tearing each other down. Lana's theatrical uniforms, fake letterhead, and elaborate presentations had been impressive theater, but they couldn't survive contact with actual facts, real documentation, and neighbors who decided to work together instead of being divided by manufactured drama. As I looked at my HOA-free zone sign catching the afternoon sun, I smiled at the reminder that sometimes the best community organizing happens when people simply decide to live like good neighbors instead of playing dress-up games with imaginary power. The sign had become something of a neighborhood landmark, a symbol not just of my victory over harassment, but of our collective decision to choose cooperation over control, authenticity over performance, and genuine community over theatrical authority.